Good morning, everybody. We are going to continue on in our studies of the earliest Americans. In fact, this is the last chapter in that unit. So we're going to finish it up. We're going to take notes tomorrow, and we will be finished with the earliest Americans before we move on to exploration of North America. But before we start this chapter in our reader, I'm going to read you a little selection about certain groups of the Native Americans, tribes of Native Americans that lived in the area that we are talking about today. And this area is called the Eastern Woodlands. Eastern Woodlands. The area, I'm going to turn my computer so you can see. It's going to have to go up because I'm going to show you on my map. Try not to unplug it. Okay. That's my camera. You don't need that. All right. So if we're looking at the map of the United States, the area that we're talking about today in Chapter 7 is here from Lake Superior. You can see it right here. And Mississippi River, which is right here. So it's east of the Mississippi. That's the area we're talking about. And not into Canada, but in the United States. So it's south of Lake Superior and all the way to the East Coast. So we're talking about the states, oh, my curtain's in the way, the states of Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, even up here in Wisconsin, Illinois, Kentucky, down to about South Carolina. So we're talking about this section of the United States, the northeast section of the United States. Everything that we're talking about today in Chapter 7, all of those tribes are located in the northeast section of the United States. Got it? Okay. I'm going to read you a little blurb about the Eastern Woodlands. The Eastern Woodlands are also called the Northeast Woodlands. The region stretches from the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River south to South Carolina, and from the East Coast all the way west to the Mississippi River. All parts of this region have a full change of seasons. So they have all 4 seasons: summer, fall, winter, spring. The physical environment includes coastal plains, river valleys, mountains, and lush forests. Farming is possible in most of these areas, and the main crops that the Native Americans grew were corn, bean, and squash. They also hunted small game and they fished to supplement their farming. They used the skins of the animals that they killed for clothing. There were 2 main house styles in the woodlands, the area we're talking about. There was the long house and there was the wigwam, or what we would probably call a teepee. The long house was built in the shape of a rectangle, but it had a rounded roof. The top and the sides were covered with bark. Some woodlands Native Americans lived in villages of longhouses that were surrounded with a wooden stockade, kind of like a fort. And in other areas of the woodlands, the people lived in wigwams. A wigwam has a pole frame, which has either cone or a dome shaped. The frame is either cone or dome shaped. The framework was then covered with mats, bark, or hides. The woodland Native Americans worshiped spirits of nature. They believed in a supreme being who was all powerful. Shamanism was part of their religious practices. A shaman is a person who, while he's in a trance, can communicate with the spirits. They speak and they act through him, according to their religion. Shamans were also medicine men whose job it was to cure the sick. Whoops, I went a little bit too far. There are, I think, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm sorry, 6. 6 different tribes that lived in this particular area that we're going to talk about. First is the Iroquois. They are a group of an Indian nations known as the Iroquois League, the Iroquois Confederacy, and later they were called the Six Nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, I destroy these names and I apologize. Cayuga and Seneca. And then finally, the Tus- Tuscaro, Tuscaroa. They're a matriarchal society. And what that means is that the mother and her children were the basic unit, not the father, mother, and the children, but the mother and the children. Each of those six Iroquois nations is a group of related family units, and they traced through their mothers. They didn't trace through their fathers, they traced through their mothers. Scamans or chiefs represent each nation at a tribal or a league council and are chosen by the female heads of the family. Allies of the British in the French and Indian War. So the Iroquois chose the British in the French and Indian War. And during the American Revolution, which happened after that, this group, except for the Oneida and the Tuscarora, they chose to be allies or they sided with the British in the American Revolution. And that is key to their eventual destruction, as you will see. Today, more than 22,000 in New York State and Ontario, Canada still exist. The Mohawks today are known for their special skills as steel workers building skyscrapers. Isn't that interesting? Okay, and here are the five tribes. That Iroquois is not its own unique tribe. It's like a confederacy. It's a group of tribes. That's why I was thinking there was only five. Okay, Mohican. They were originally found along the Hudson River in what is now New York State. Remember we talked, oh no, we didn't talk about that yet. We will talk about that. See, I'm getting ahead of myself. In our next unit, Exploration of North America, we're going to find out why that river is called the Hudson River. But now we just need to know it's in New York State. So the Mohican were originally found along what is the Hudson River in what is currently New York State. The Mohican were driven east by the Mohawks. So while they originally started in New York at the Hudson River, they were pushed east, which, if you are familiar with a map of the United States, that does not leave very much space for them to move because New York is, well, part of it is on the Atlantic coast, but the upper part of New York is more inland, but there isn't a lot of space to go east when you're in New York. Uh, the Mohican fought against white settlements, but they ultimately ended up selling their land to the white settlers. And today there's very few surviving Mohicans, and the ones who do survive live on a reservation in Connecticut, which, if you look at the United States map, you can see is right on the Gulf Coast. I mean, the Atlantic coast. It feels like a Monday. The next tribe we're going to talk about is the Delaware. They were also known as the Lenni Lenape. This group, Delaware, were originally found in the Delaware River Basin in Pennsylvania. Imagine that. They're called after the place where they're found. Also, New Jersey and this Delaware River Basin is found in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. It's in that area right there. The Delaware Indians made a treaty with William Penn in 1680, and we will find out who William Penn is when we go after our exploration of North America and we move on to the 13 colonies. We'll find out who William Penn was. The Delaware Indian were forced out by the whites and the Iroquois Confederacy in the 1700s. The Delaware, like many of the Native American tribes, allied or sided with the British in the American Revolution. And the few remaining members of the Delaware tribe live on reservations in Oklahoma and then in Ontario, Canada. There are very few in the United States today. The Susquehannocks, they are from southern New York, so that is the area that's closer to the East Coast. And then across central Pennsylvania to the end of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. So in a very small area as well. This group of Indians Native Americans agreed to live under English colonial governments, but eventually they lost their land to the white settlers who the government couldn't control. The last remaining members of this tribe, the Susquehannocks, was massacred in 1763. There are no remaining people, Native American peoples, with this heritage in the United States. Massachusetts, originally, these people lived in an area, what is today the area of Boston, which is in the state of what? Massachusetts. Guess why they're called that? And the suburbs of Boston. They sided with the colonists in the Metacoms War, that's King Philip's War, in 1675 and 1676. This is before the American Revolution. But they lost land to the settlers anyway. It didn't matter that they sided with the settlers against the king. They still lost their land. There are no known groups of Massachusetts that have survived beyond the 1800s. So again, there are no people currently living who can claim a Massachusetts heritage. The last known survivor died in the early 1800s. The Powhatan Confederacy, that name probably sounds familiar to you, and we will learn more about it when we do our unit on the 13 colonies. This confederacy itself was 30 tribes, and they had over 200 settlements. All of them were enclosed with stockades, and they were along the coasts of Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay, so right on the Atlantic coast. The colony of Jamestown, which we'll learn about when we study the 13 colonies, was established on their land. They already had that land. They already had settled there. That was what they were claiming as their place to be. And when the colony of Jamestown was established, it was right on their land. The marriage of Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, to John Rolfe eased the tensions between the settlers and the Native Americans for a short period of time. Eventually, warfare did erupt, and it continued off and on until all of the Native American tribes were effectively crushed in 1644. There are a very few of them who still exist in Eastern Virginia. All right, that was the background of this chapter that we're going to start reading in our earliest American readers. I did want to read that to you so that I could make sure you understood where everything is happening and what is going on at this particular time that we are doing this. All right, let's go ahead and begin in our chapter. If you're following along in the physical copy of this book, we will be on page 44. If you are following along in the PDF file, the title of this chapter is The Eastern Woodlands. And I have to tell you that of all of the information in this unit, The Earliest Americans, this chapter is my favorite. It has a lot of information, and it's just really a cool chapter. And as we get towards the end of the chapter and we start talking about the Haudenosaunee Council, you'll understand maybe why this is my favorite chapter, knowing where I stand on the Constitution. Okay, let's go ahead and begin chapter 7, The Eastern Woodlands. The section is entitled Living in the Woodlands. By the time Columbus landed in 1492, many different native peoples were living in the eastern woodlands of North America. The eastern woodlands stretch from Lake Superior to the Atlantic coast. And I already showed you on the map where that was. If you have a map of the United States, you might want to look at that again so you can kind of solidify in your mind where this group of people that we're talking about right now, where they lived. Because the way that the United States was originally settled will help you understand the connection between this particular group of people that we're talking about and the colonists. The landscape of the eastern woodlands was mostly forest. Now, we know that landscape means like the physical features of the area. So in Bella Vista, where we live, the landscape is, at least by my house, and in most of Bella Vista, is still mostly forested, and Bella Vista is on the side of a mountain. So it's hilly and there's forest and there's a little bit of cleared area that's kind of grassy and rocky. The soil is not very good for growing, but that's the landscape of this particular area. That's what they mean by landscape. Most people lived in clearings near creeks, rivers, lakes, or ponds between the forested areas. Now, why do you think that they would live near the water? Exactly, for a couple of reasons. Number one, they needed water to survive. People cannot survive without water. And number two, the creeks and the rivers and the ponds and the lakes, those would be good sources of food. They could get fish out of there. So that would be another reason why they would live there. There was plenty of wood for building and for fuel. There were many big and small animals and birds to hunt. There was almost a year-round supply of fish. That's why they lived by the water, right? There were lots of roots, berries, and nuts to collect. The three sisters. Besides all of the food that was available just outside the door, the land could be cleared in order to plant crops. The soil was rich, even though in some areas the growing season was very short. I'm going to go ahead and pull my curtain back down like I had it to block out the cold because I pushed it back so we could see the map, but now I'm feeling a cold breeze. It's still really cold here. The soil was rich, even though in some areas the growing season was short. Corn, bean, and squash were the main crops. Here is a picture of longhouses. The Haudenosaunee lived in longhouses. One Eastern Woodland people, the Haudenosaunee, called these main crops the Three Sisters because all three of these crops were planted together. Corn seeds were planted in rows of little hills, one step apart. So they would build up a little mound. They would drop some corn seeds. They would take one step. They would build up a little mound. They would drop more corn seeds. They would take one more step and they would build up another mound. And that's how they planted them, one step apart. Beans were planted between the corn plants. So they would plant in between those, in this part where they didn't have the mound, that's where they would put the bean seeds. And so then the beans could climb up the corn stalks. I don't know if you've ever seen beans grow, but they grow kind of on a viney structure. And beans need an upright structure for them to attach their little vines to so that they can grow up. The beans could climb up the corn stalks as they grew taller. And if you know, the stalk of a corn is that thick part of the plant that grows upright like that. Squash was grown in the low areas between the hills. The broad leaves of the squash plant provided shade to stop the weeds from growing. And the squash plants also kept the ground moist. So they would plant them all three together. The Eastern Woodlands people lived in small villages. They built their houses out of forest materials. Around the Great Lakes, people built wigwams. A wigwam had the framework of poles pounded into the ground in a circle, and then these poles were tied together at the top to make a dome. Barks, reeds, or mats were used for the walls. Fires were built in the middle of the floor, and smoke escaped through the hole at the top. The definition of a wigwam is a dome-shaped dwelling made of poles tied together with bark covering the sides, built by the Eastern Woodlands people. And longhouses, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, they were large rectangular dwelling with doors located at each end and fires inside. Typically, there were 5 fire pits inside a longhouse, 5 to 10. The Haudenosaunee didn't live in wigwams. They lived in longhouses. They were also built with wooden poles. The houses formed long rectangles with door at each end. There were fire pits in the center of the rooms. Smoke escaped through the holes in the roof. Longhouses were about 20 feet wide. They could be long or short depending on how many families lived in the building. A typical longhouse held 10 families with 5 fire pits. So 10 families, 5 fire pits. And here's what a longhouse looked like, or may have looked like inside. Clearly, we didn't have any cameras back then. The Mohican, another group of the Eastern Woodlands Native Americans, their name comes from Mohicanuk. Mohicanuk. meaning great water that is always moving, either flowing or ebbing. To ebb means to move away from the shore. Stories passed down for many years tell about the Mohican crossing over the water that gave them their name. This water, said the legend, was far in the north. There, two lands were nearly connected. Does that sound like Beringia? Yeah. Then the Mohican traveled east. They crossed many rivers. And finally, they found a place that seemed like a home. It was in the valley of the Hudson River. The Mohicans spent years fighting against neighboring nations. The Mohawk were their bitterest enemies. Both groups became great fighters because of their constant battles with each other. So they were fierce warriors. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Now we're on page 49. In the 1500s, there was plenty of food, but not very many people in the rich woodlands of the Northeast. Still, the woodland nations quarreled among themselves. They needed a way to stop the fighting. 5 nations formed a confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Most of the nations who joined the Confederacy lived in what is now New York State. The nations were the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Seneca, the Oneida, and the Cayuga. They did this to keep the peace among themselves and to unite against their enemies. One by one, each chief or sachem agreed to the plan. They knew that their survival depended on cooperation. And the definition of sachem is a chief in the northeastern Native American nation. The Confederacy discussed problems and they found solutions at council meetings. They had their own laws. All adults, men and women, had a voice in making the decisions. The women were very good farmers. They produced much of the food that the Haudenosaunee ate, and as a result, they had a major voice in the tribal meetings. The Haudenosaunee men were mighty warriors. Remember, they had all those years of fighting each other to become great warriors. They were feared by the Native American and French enemies. It is sometimes said that the Haudenosaunee. Oops, I dropped my book. Let me find my spot. I guess I should hold it with 2 hands, right? It is sometimes said that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy influenced the contents of the United States Constitution. Even so, several Eastern Woodlands nations, including the Haudenosaunee, sided with the British during the American Revolution. When the United States gained its independence, it was a serious defeat for the Haudenosaunee. They could no longer expect help from the British. They had to try to stop thousands of settlers from seizing their lands on their own. The strength of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy greatly impressed many people. Some Confederacy ceremonies became famous throughout the United States. For example, the Confederacy's council meetings were always called to order by smoking of a pipe. They say smoking the peace pipe comes from this tradition. And a peace pipe is a ceremonial pipe that was used by the Native Americans. Like burying the hatchet. Remember, they literally dug a hole and buried the hatchet, which means to lay down your weapons and to live at peace. Smoking the peace pipe has become part of our everyday language. We now call them idioms. It means sitting down and calmly talking over a problem to reach a fair solution. That's what smoking the peace pipe means. One sad part of American history is the struggle between the European Americans and the Native American people. Their ways of life were completely different. European Americans wanted to take the land for farms. Native Americans got their food by hunting and gathering over large areas or by farming on small amounts of land. Losing huge amounts of land to settlers meant giving up their traditional way of life. Many Native Americans fought until they were defeated or driven away. Many others died of the diseases that the Europeans brought with them. Unfortunately, ways could not be found to bury the hatchet or smoke the peace pipe between these two groups. A great many Native Americans lost their way of life and their land upon which their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. Here is a picture of a Haudenosaunee Council meeting or what they think that it would be like, because obviously we did not have any cameras back then. Okay, let's answer some questions about this chapter that we just read. All right. Why were the Eastern Woodlands such a good place for Native Americans to live? Why do you think it was? Exactly. Think about the landscape. There was a lot of wooded area, but there was also small clearings where they could build. There's many sources of water. There was year-round fishing, and there were small animals to hunt and berries, nuts, fruit, that kind of thing to gather and to eat. So it was a land that was rich in natural resources. Remember we talked about those? So a land that's rich in its natural resources. Actually, we might not talk about that yet. But anyway, so there were things for them to eat and different materials for them to use to build their homes that they needed. What were the three sisters? Do you remember what those were? Corn is one, beans is the second one, and squash. And why were they called the three sisters? Do you remember that? Well, they were called the three sisters because they were always planted together. The corn was planted first, and each of the corn seeds were planted in a mound that was one step apart from the other one. The beans were planted right next to the corn so that when the beans grew up, they could use the corn stalks to, the vines could use the corn stalks to crawl on and to attach themselves to. And then the squash was planted in that deep space, the space between the two mounds. And this was good because the squash has huge leaves, and those leaves would keep the moisture into the ground so that the plants wouldn't dry out, but it would also shade the ground enough that the weeds would not grow. What kinds of houses did what kinds of houses did the native people who lived around the Great Lakes build? What kinds of houses did they build? Well, those people that lived around the Great Lakes, that was not the Haudenosaunee, but the other people, they built wigwams. Wigwams were sticks that were stuck into the ground, and then they were covered with bark and um, mats and reeds, that kind of stuff. That's what they were covered with a hole in the top for the smoke from the fire to escape. Now, who lived in the longhouses? Yes, the Haudenosaunee longhouses. And how many families could live in a longhouse? How many families could live there? As many as 10 families could live in a longhouse, and they would have like five, they could have as many as 5 fire pits in each of those longhouses. How were the wigwams and the longhouses similar? Right, they were both made from materials that they could find in the forest. And how were they different? Wigwams were small dome shaped and they had a hole in the top. And longhouses were long. They were also dome shaped, but they had a door at each end. They were long rectangular structures. What does the name Mohican mean? Remember, this was the group that came from possibly Beringia. The name Mohican, it means great water that is always moving, either flowing or ebbing. That's what it means. And they got this name because they had to cross many bodies of water to end up where they finally did, settling in the Hudson Valley in what is now New York State. Why was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, why was it formed? What was the reason for the formation of that confederacy? Exactly, it was formed to keep peace among the tribes, the Native American groups that joined the Confederacy, and those were the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Seneca, the Onondaga, and Cayuga. So to keep peace among themselves, but also to help them unite against their common enemies. And their common enemies were other Native American tribes outside of those 5, and also the French. The French at that time were very active in that part of the United States, and so they were a definite threat to the Native Americans. In the council meetings, who participated in the discussions about problems? Every single adult, men and women. Yes, every single adult participated in the discussions. How did the American victory and the American Revolution harm the Haudenosaunee? Exactly. They sided with the British in the American Revolution. So after the British lost the war and the Americans won the war, the Haudenosaunee no longer had any help or protection from the British. So they had to try among themselves to keep the settlers from taking their land. And that was not something that they were very successful at. What does the expression smoking the peace pipe, what does that mean? Exactly. It means to sit down and calmly discuss something that's causing trouble. And it's considered a way to reach a solution that is fair to everybody. That's the another piece of it. And then finally, why did the European Americans and the Native Americans fight? Why did they fight? Well, they had different ways of life. That's the biggest reason that they fought is they had seriously different ways of life. The Native Americans had very, very small farms, if they had them at all, and then they needed vast amounts of land, which they hunted and gathered. So they were still hunter gatherers at that point, although they did settle in one spot. And the settlers were the opposite. They did not want to go out and hunt and gather things. What they wanted to do is have huge farms that took up a lot of land so that they could grow everything that they needed right there at their fingertips. So that was the biggest thing is the way that they got their food and the way that they farmed. Um, Actually, that's pretty much what it is. So the disagreements occurred when the settlers tried to take away the land that the Native Americans had been using for years, and the settlers tried to settle it by putting these big farms on it, which took away places for the Native Americans to hunt and to fish and to gather. Okay, what was the purpose of the Haudenosaunee Council? Yes, to maintain peace between those five tribes and to unite those five tribes so that they could, um, together, they were stronger against their common enemies, which were other Native Americans and the French. So it united them against their enemies. All right, that's all that I got for you today. We'll be back tomorrow to take some notes on chapter 7. And as I said, that will be the end of the earliest Americans unit. And then we will move on to the exploration of North America. You guys have a great day, and I'll be back tomorrow. Bye.